I didn't expect a simple waltz to change the course of my life, or anyone else's. But sometimes the smallest moments have a way of rewriting the entire story you thought you were living. That night in the ballroom, with music echoing off chandeliers and strangers' faces blurring into the golden light, I didn't realize someone was watching me with a look that could only mean they'd been waiting for that exact moment for years. If you believe kindness has a way of finding its way back to you, even when you're not looking for it, then make sure to like this video and subscribe, because this is one of those nights I'll never forget. The whole thing began with my daughter Lily. Her excitement infectious from the moment she learned her school choir had been invited to perform at the charity gala in the Grand Regency Hotel. She'd spent weeks practicing in the living room, her little voice filling our cramped apartment while I sat on the couch with a mug of coffee, doing my best to hide the ache in my knee from an old firefighting injury. I promised her I'd be there no matter how awkward I felt among tuxedos and designer dresses, and I meant it. By the time we walked into that ballroom, it was like stepping into another world. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, crystal chandeliers dripping light onto rows of white linen tables, and a live string quartet coaxing a waltz into the air as if the notes themselves were part of the decor. I tried to fade into the edges of the crowd, staying near the refreshment table while Lily lined up with the other children in their matching choir outfits, her eyes wide and sparkling. That's when I noticed him, a boy in a wheelchair, sitting alone at the far end of the room. He couldn't have been more than 10, dressed in a little navy suit with a red bow tie slightly crooked, his hair combed with careful precision. He wasn't looking at the food or the people. His gaze was locked on the dance floor, watching couples sweep past in graceful arcs. The longing in his expression hit me in a place I thought had gone numb long ago. For a while I told myself to leave it alone. He was probably waiting for someone, and I didn't belong in the middle of this kind of scene. But something in the way his fingers tapped the armrest in time with the music told me he wasn't just waiting. He was wishing. So I walked over, crouched down to his level, and said, "Looks like you've got a front row seat to the best part of the night." His eyes flicked toward me, cautious but curious, like he wasn't sure if I was making fun of him or not. "I've never danced before," he said finally, his voice low, like a confession. "People think I can't, so they don't ask." The music swelled around us, and I could feel the answer forming before I even thought it through. "Well," I said, glancing at the open stretch of floor, "I think they're wrong. Want to prove it?" For a heartbeat, he just stared at me, then a slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Okay," he said, almost like a dare. I positioned myself behind his chair, my hands on the handles, and waited for the downbeat. The quartet's violins lifted, and we were off, spinning gently at first, then gliding in sweeping arcs across the ballroom floor, the wheels catching the light with every turn. His laughter rang out, sharp and bright, cutting through the polite murmurs of the crowd, and I couldn't help laughing with him. Heads turned, conversations paused. I caught glimpses of raised eyebrows, soft smiles, even a few people pulling out phones to record. But the only thing that mattered in that moment was the pure joy radiating from the kid in the chair. We waltzed past the towering arrangements of white roses, past the table of gala donors with champagne flutes in hand, past my daughter, who stood with her choir friends grinning like she'd never been prouder of me. It wasn't until our final spin slowed to a stop that I noticed her, standing near the champagne bar, a tall woman in a silver gown, her blonde hair swept into an elegant twist, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something more than politeness in her eyes, something closer to recognition, maybe even gratitude. But before I could think too much about it, the boy, Jamie, he told me when I asked, was beaming up at me, his cheeks flushed. "That was amazing," he said, and I realized my hands were still on the back of his chair, reluctant to let go. I wheeled him back toward his spot, only to be intercepted by the woman in silver. Up close, she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with the gown or the diamonds at her throat. There was an intensity to her, like every thought she had was calculated and purposeful. "That was beautiful," she said softly, her gaze shifting between me and Jamie. "You didn't have to do that." I shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Didn't feel like I had to. Just seemed like you wanted to dance. She smiled at that, but it wasn't a casual smile. It was small and knowing, like she'd just been handed a piece of a puzzle she'd been working on for a long time. She turned to Jamie and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Why don't you introduce me to your new friend? And that's when she told me her name, Isabella Sterling. I'd heard it before, though I couldn't place where, and in the glow of the ballroom, I didn't think to question why it made my chest tighten. All I knew in that moment was that my daughter was waving for me from the choir risers. Jamie was still smiling like the night had just begun, and Isabella Sterling was looking at me as though she knew something I didn't, something that was about to matter a whole lot more than I could possibly imagine. Isabella's gaze lingered on me longer than I was comfortable with, but there was no arrogance in it, just an intensity that made me feel like she was measuring the weight of my soul. Lily's choir began singing again, their young voices threading through the ballroom like silver ribbons, but I barely heard the music. Jamie was still beside me, animatedly describing his favorite parts of our dance, and Isabella listened with the kind of focus you'd expect from a mother who'd been holding back tears all night. When the applause broke out at the end of the song, she leaned closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "Mr. Carter, you used to be a firefighter, didn't you?" My chest tightened instantly, though I didn't confirm it. Very few people outside my circle knew that chapter of my life, mostly because it came with stories I didn't want to revisit. "I thought so," she murmured, her lips curving in something halfway between a smile and a sigh. "5 years ago, there was a fire at Westbrook Elementary. You carried a boy out of a burning classroom just seconds before the ceiling collapsed." I felt my breath catch. I remembered that night vividly. The heat, the smoke so thick it clawed at my lungs, the faint sound of a child coughing somewhere beyond a wall of flame. I'd found him in the corner, huddled under a desk, his small frame shaking, the smell of burning plaster in the air. I'd scooped him up without thinking, my gear scraping the doorway as I barreled through. I'd never learned his name, just handed him to the paramedics and went back inside for the others. "That was you," Isabella said, her hand resting lightly on Jamie's chair. "And this is the boy you saved." I stared at Jamie, seeing him in a new light, as if the suit and the bow tie were falling away to reveal a memory I'd carried without knowing who it belonged to. He was looking up at me, wide-eyed, like maybe he'd known all along. "The doctors said the smoke inhalation and a pre-existing spinal condition made things worse," Isabella continued, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion underneath. "But you gave him a chance to live. Every day since then, I've wished I could thank you in person." My throat felt thick, my usual defenses useless against the sincerity in her tone. I muttered something about just doing my job, but she shook her head sharply, as though she wouldn't allow me to diminish it. "No. You did more than your job. You gave my son a future." Lily bounded over just then, flushed from singing and clutching a cookie from the refreshment table, her eyes darting between us. "Daddy, you danced with him," she said to Jamie, as if this was the most important news in the world. Jamie grinned, and I felt the warmth of the moment wrap around us like a blanket. Still, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent. Why was Isabella here tonight? And why did it feel like she'd been waiting for this encounter? As if reading my thoughts, she said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately, when you have a moment. There's something I want to ask." The request hung between us, heavy with meaning I couldn't yet decipher. But in her eyes, I caught a flicker of something unexpected. Hope, yes, but also an unshakable certainty, as though she already knew what my answer would be. I didn't know it then, but the conversation we were about to have would not only tie the past to the present, it would redraw the lines of my future entirely. We stepped out into the quieter side hall of the ballroom, where the sound of clinking glasses and orchestral music faded to a distant hum, and for a moment Isabella simply studied me, as if deciding where to begin. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice softer now, "I've spent years trying to give Jamie the best life possible, but tonight you reminded me of something I can't buy him. Moments where he feels like everyone else. You gave him that without hesitation." I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, letting her words settle. She went on to explain that she was funding a new citywide program for children with disabilities, sports, arts, dance, activities designed so no child ever had to sit on the sidelines, and she needed someone to lead it. "Not a figurehead," she said firmly. "Someone who will actually be there, rolling up their sleeves, showing these kids what's possible. Someone like the man who carried my son out of a burning school and then waltzed him across a ballroom." My first instinct was to turn her down. I wasn't looking for charity, and part of me still felt like the man I used to be had been left behind in the smoke years ago. But when I glanced back into the ballroom, I saw Lily laughing with Jamie, spinning his chair in little circles while the music swelled, and something inside me shifted. Maybe this wasn't about charity, it was about purpose. I don't know if I'm the man you think I am, I admitted, my voice low. Isabella smiled, not with politeness, but with quiet certainty. I think you're exactly who I think you are. Weeks later, I stood in a sunlit community center gym, watching Jamie lead a line of kids, some in wheelchairs, some running, through their first dance steps, while Lily handed out ribbons she'd made herself. Isabella watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable, but her eyes bright. And I realized then that one dance had turned into something far bigger, a second chance not just for me, but for every child in that room. Sometimes you don't have to wait for the right moment. You can make it, right there on the floor, one step at a time.